All right, so claim one. Increasing the quantity of schooling will reduce inequality. And I'm going to draw here from three kinds of research. Age cutoff studies, early childhood education, which as you know is probably the most powerful of these, and evidence from summer versus academic year learning. I think they all point to the idea that increasing the quantity of schooling will reduce racial inequality. Age cutoff studies. So my former colleague Fred Morrison, who actually was at Loyola here until in this city until a few years ago. He moved to Michigan, and I came back down here. Has done a series of fascinating studies. What he does is he and his colleagues take kids who are just on one side or the other of the legal age of going to school. And so these kids are basically statistically virtually identical except for tiny differences in age. But some of those kids, a lot of those kids who are legally old enough, most of them go to school, not all of them, but most of them, and virtually none of the ones who, who are too young go to school. So you have these almost like a randomized experiment to see what is the impact of schooling. And the result is dramatic. Kids learn tremendously in terms of their literacy skills. Now, here's a really important point for the future discussion and something for all of us to think about. His evidence suggests that kids were not learning vocabulary in school. It's very interesting. Why? Probably because the emphasis on early reading is so much on decoding familiar text that kids are not, if you're, and that's a great thing to do. We need to do that. But if all of the text is familiar, they're not learning new words. So we've got to figure out how to bring a richer language into the early years of schooling, and I think we could push that back and talk about preschools as well. The second one is expand early childhood education. Now this is not, despite the fact that you invited me, maybe it was under false pretenses, this is not my area of primary expertise. But I have studied the research on this, and there is a wonderful book by Kruger and Heckman that does a very interesting, they really disagree a lot, but they agree on something important, which is they agree on pretty much what the research tells us in terms of the cost-benefit of early childhood education. You all know about the Perry preschool study, very small sample study, but a randomized experiment in which kids were followed into adulthood, very influential. We see short-term effects on cognitive skill. I'm going to talk for a little bit later about why those effects are short-term. I want to come back to that point. But remarkable long-term effects in terms of educational attainment, earnings as adults, and lower crime. That was actually, I think most of us thought, a pretty thin read, a wonderful study, but a single study, very small sample, and a thin read on which to base policy. And more recently now, we're getting some new news on Head Start. And this is interesting because Head Start is far less intensive, as you know, than either the Perry Preschool or the Carolina Abecedarian. And yet we're seeing effects on cognitive skills and social-emotional outcomes, and in fact on parenting. And that's a randomized experiment. And we just had a talk in our workshop. David Deming from Harvard has done a fascinating study going way back. And the beauty of this is he can go way, way back and over many, many years study the effect of Head Start using not a randomized experiment, we didn't have it then, but comparing siblings who went, one of whom went and one of whom did not go to Head Start. Finding, and it's not as good as a randomized experiment, but it's better in that it's a much larger sample over a much larger period of time with very similar results to the Head Start experiment and about 80% of the effect size of Abecedarian and Perry Preschool in terms of some of the main outcomes. So a less intensive, certainly, intervention, but producing a very substantial effect. So there's a lot of evidence that putting kids in good early childhood programs will help. And that's one of the ways that we can extend schooling, as you know, extend it downward in age. That's probably the most important way that we can add to the quantity of schooling. Now, the quality, you are going to tell me how we're going to make those settings of such a quality that the kids that we care most about are coming into kindergarten not behind the way Valerie Lee and David Burkham have written about in their important paper on inequality at the starting gate. And so we need to discuss that. But very hopeful in terms of early childhood education, as you know. And then I want to say something about summer setbacks. You probably know about this. And this may have something to do with the fade out. I think it does have something to do with why effects fade out, because middle class kids are home during the summer, usually, although increasingly they have other places to go, whereas working class and poorer kids, who are disproportionately minority, there's plenty of middle class minority kids, but disproportionately minority, are in the home environment, which has many good qualities, but academic instruction is not necessarily the most important quality that they're getting. And the result is we see things like this from the early childhood longitudinal study. We see this gap is, these are kids who attend high and low SES schools, so this is not by race, but you see something similar. Kids who attend high SES schools in kindergarten come in with this gap that Burkham and Lee talked about in terms of reading. They actually have rather similar growth rates during the academic year. The high SES kids a little bit faster, but not that huge different. But then a bigger summer setback for the low SES kids. So the gap ends up widening, you see, by the fall of first grade, and then at the end of first grade. And then during first grade and reading, again, there is a difference. It's hard to see in slopes, faster growth for the highest, but it's not huge. But this gap is quite a bit bigger than this gap, and a lot of it has to do with the summer setback. So that's one of the reasons. Now, we can do a lot, I think, to make these slopes better for the low SES kids while they're in school. I'm going to talk about that. But this summer setback is one of the possible explanations for why we see a fade out in the impact in terms of cognitive skills and the impact of the early childhood interventions. So the point here is that we need policies that create continuity between powerful early schooling interventions and what happens K through 12, both during the academic year and the summer. And we're not organized to do that well, which is one of the reasons I'm excited to be here, because most people in ed schools don't think about what happens, and they're not paid or rewarded for thinking about what happens before kindergarten. So the policy implications seem pretty clear of this. Expand early childhood education, extend the school day, extend the school year, and we'll say a little bit more about that later. These things we can expect, we can anticipate will reduce social class inequality and thereby race inequality, since minority kids are disproportionately working class and poor. Claim 2, increasing and equalizing school quality can reduce racial inequality and outcomes. And here I'm going to focus on value-added studies. Those are the studies of the impacts of individual teachers, a new line of fascinating research. Studies of resources, which generally have not been very positive. So a lot of studies of the impact of per pupil expenditure have not shown much, and this has been disappointing ever since the days of Coleman back in 1965, and with Eric Hanushek's, a very renowned economist of education, arguing that money doesn't matter. But we have some new evidence that if you use money in certain ways, it does matter. I'm going to talk about that. And then I want to say something about subject matter instruction, about how we can organize it to increase quality, and if we do so, it's going to reduce racial inequality. Value-added studies. So basic idea here is, here's a kid coming in at time L, which is the first year. This is a little bit technical, sorry about that. Who gets a teacher. Now that line is what we would expect, the growth line, the growth that we would expect of that kid if that kid had average teachers. What the value-added study does is it says, oh look, that first teacher that child got deflected that child from the expected growth curve up. And then this fortunate young child got another really good teacher, had another deflection. You see, and statistically we can measure these deflections that teachers bring to bear on their kids. And then another smaller deflection. So in this is kind of a fortunate child. And the discrepancy between where this child is at the end of these 3 years and where we would have expected that child is the cumulative effect of the sequence of teachers we have. Now, I'm not going to show you what happens if you're unlucky and you end up down here, not because of anything about yourself or your family, but literally because of the teacher that you encounter. And what we see is enormous, seemingly almost random variability in the effects of teachers. And luck is playing a big role, although this is much more socially structured than we might imagine. So teachers vary enormously in their impacts. And we also know, my wife, Guanglei Hong, has done some work on this, that teachers vary enormously in their practices. How much time do elementary school teachers, for example, spend teaching reading, teaching math? Just the sheer amount of time, or how they do it. Huge variability. But we know very, very little about how what happens in the classroom contributes to this tremendous variability in the contributions of teachers to children. You know, it's so interesting. I mean, imagine if you were a patient and they said, you know, you were admitted to a hospital, you have a serious disease, and you were told, well, the doctor you're assigned to is going to make a huge difference. Now, we don't know whether you should have surgery. The doctor will decide that. We don't know whether you should have medicine or just maybe you should change your lifestyle. Different doctors will say different things. We don't know anything about that. All we know is the physician that we assign you to is probably going to have, you know, decide whether you know, how well you thrive or whether you do live at all. Nobody would put up with that. Everybody would want to know, should this kind of person have surgery, or what should you have? What is the clinical practice? We haven't had that spirit yet in education of finding out what works and making sure that kids get what works.